Welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission Eligibility and Budget Review Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We are using Zoom with a goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please use the raise hand feature. Please utilize this tool to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. A friendly reminder that this is a video conference and please be aware of the surroundings behind you. All LSTFC and committee meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar website. Zoom captioning is available. To enable, select live transcript at the bottom of your Zoom screen, then select enable transcript. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we have a quorum, right? Did you need to take roll before
Yes.
we go to our public comment? We're gonna do the public comment first, right?
Yes, I'll take roll first and then we can
Sounds
move on
great.
to
Thank
that.
you so much.
Sure. Blakemore,
Here.
Gonzalez,
Here.
King,
Here.
Klein, Morales, Vargas. I'm sorry, did Vargas? Oh, I can see you, but we can't hear you right now.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Great. And then I'll do liaisons and state bar staff. So, Copeland, Klein,
Lauren Klein's here.
Snyder. Okay, and then I see Dwan, Heidi, and Raul from the state bar. Great, thank you. We can now move on to public comment if you would like, Catherine.
Okay, I was asked to read a brief statement before we begin our public comment period. So I would like to remind everyone that under the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, public comments must pertain to items that are on the agenda or related matters that are within the jurisdiction of this agency. Specifically, the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission's Eligibility Committee exercises oversight on eligibility matters related to IOLTA and equal access grants. This committee does not have authority over attorney discipline, and there are no attorney discipline matters on the agenda for today's meeting. So thank you for listening to the sort of jurisdiction of this committee and what we can accept public comments on. And if there are public comments now, I would welcome hearing from them and ask that you limit your comments to 3 minutes.
It's one person. I'll allow them to speak.
Thank you so much. Mr. Carrico?
Yes. I'm the directing attorney at the Yuba Sutter Legal Center for Seniors. And as you may recall, our auditor was unable or unwilling to get us our report in time to complete our application for the IOLTA funding. And unfortunately, it wasn't just a normal funding year. It was a year that was meant to help us shore up our resources to increase staffing and retention and salaries over the next several years to make us a stronger, better institution. And following that, I was told we had the opportunity to send a request for reconsideration, which I did. And then I was informed about this meeting yesterday afternoon, and I was informed that I could make a public comment. I do not know how this process works or if you're even able to rectify anything now, notwithstanding that we have the ability to ask for the request for reconsideration. Since this event, we have closed our office on Fridays. I'm the only salaried member of the team, so I'm here. We have a new volunteer that started. We've had to make one team member, and when I worked in London, we would have called it redundant. We let one go. We've cut our hours of everybody down. There's no 5-day-a-week persons except me. There's now 4 days and 3 days. And that with the redundancy that we had, we basically have corrected or adjusted for the economic implications of the non-funding for this year, but we aren't able to do that for the following years because it was, I think, 254% of what one received in 23 is what was affected. So I do not know how you are able to rectify this, or if you are. It could be that it's an anomaly in the system that allows us to raise our hand and request for reconsideration, but might not be any tools for you to do that. I hope there are. And I know that you know that we do good work. And so I'm raising my hand here in the request for reconsideration to see if that is possible. Notwithstanding, I have no idea where the funds would come from or how the process would be, but I do raise my hand now.
Thank you. Thank you for your public comment. We appreciate hearing from you. And I think this is an item that comes up later on our agenda, and we appreciate your input into that item. Thank you.
Would it be beneficial for me to wait and for you to address that, or would it sort of not be helpful at all for me to?
Well, I think we understand your music. We understand your perspective. It's certainly up to you if you want to wait. You could look at the materials. They're posted on the State Bar's website and review those. I think it's quite a bit later in the agenda, maybe. So and decide if you wanted to stay. Maybe that's the best choice.
Okay, because I haven't been able to access the ones on the links. They haven't been accessible to me, but I can try the website and see if I can find it there.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. We are on to.
Sorry, Catherine, I believe there's another person who would like
I'm
to.
so sorry. I didn't understand that. And I think Selena has now joined us.
Great.
Is there another commenter?
Yeah.
Kevin Prindivall, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. This is Kevin Prindivall. I'm the Executive Director at Justice and Aging. I just wanted to appear and express support for an agenda item later today for an approval of a budget deviation for our 2022 EAF budget. The deviation resulted from a change in staffing at the end of 2021. One of our staff that was originally on our original EAF budget left the organization, and we added a new staff person to work on the EAF project in early 2022. That change in staffing didn't materially affect the total personnel expenses allocated to the budget, but it did impact the line items within the budget. So the new hire was a policy advocate, not an attorney, who works on policy issues like our attorneys, but since she's not an attorney, we did not report her time on the attorney line of the budget. We reported it on the other personnel line. So that created a variance in the line items for attorney salaries and salaries for other staff. So that's the reason for the deviation. We apologize that we didn't submit a request for modification sooner. We intended to, and we were dealing with some transitions and health issues within our finance department, and that request wasn't made earlier. So we are here today to ask for approval of the deviation, and I can be available later in the meeting if you do have any questions, but otherwise appreciate the consideration and important work of this committee.
Thank you, Kevin, for the information that will be helpful to us as we review that item. Appreciate that. Are there other public comments?
I don't see anybody else with their hand raised.
Okay, so we will proceed with our agenda. Before we get started, I wanted to just acknowledge the work of staff who I know worked very hard to put all of these materials together. So grateful for that, and the people that do the logistics for this meeting, which there's a lot of meetings coming up, so I can only imagine the competing priorities for getting all the materials done and the meetings organized. So thank you very much to all of you who support the work of this committee and the commission. And I think next up is our minutes from the last meeting. Am I correct? Okay.
Yes.
So we have, you have in the meeting materials, minutes from our last meeting. Does anyone have any comments or questions for those meeting minutes? I'm not seeing any. Is there a motion to approve the meeting minutes?
I'll
Motion
move.
to approve.
Thank you, Angie. Is there a second?
I'll second. This is Xavier.
Thank you, Xavier. Appreciate it. Any other discussion? And if not, we will ask our staff to do the roll call.
Gonzalez,
Yes.
King,
Yes.
Klein, Morales, Vargas,
Yes.
Blakemore.
Yes.
4 yeses, no nos, the motion carries.
Thank you, Erica. And I think that now takes us into the substance of our agenda. And so we have an agenda item, I think it's 7.1, and I think staff will have some slides, and I believe Heidi is leading us in this discussion. So take it away, Heidi.
Hi there. Erica, are you gonna do this?
Yes, I can share my screen.
Thank you. Thanks, Erica. All right, so good afternoon, commissioners. I'm reporting on 7.1, which is the review of 2022 and IOLTA and, well, 2022 and 2023, excuse me, IOLTA and EAF grant closures. And within that, there is some related budget deviations that we'll discuss, and we'll seek the commission's or the committee recommendation to approve those. Next slide. During this topic, we will I'll provide a little background, and then we will look at each of the 2022 and 2023 grant closeouts separately or individually, and then also the unreported IOLTA and EAF budgets for those for each of those years, and present a proposed resolution. Next slide. Just to give you a little context, and sort of maybe you're wondering why we're talking about 2022 at this point, but we've conducted the closeout for IOLTA 2022 and 2025. This was a particularly an interesting year because our grant cycle, because the dates were not what they have typically been in the past. So for IOLTA specifically, that grant started in January of 2022, and it went all the way through December of 2022, and then there was a carryover option available to go all the way through 2023, and that carryover period was longer than normal to align with the EAF 2-year grant cycle that was allowed by the commission. Whereas the 2022 grant cycle was from January 2022 through December 2023, and then there was an additional 6-month carryover permitted through June 30th of 2024. So that's why we closed this is why we're presenting the entirety of the closeout period for those 2 grants at this period. For the 2023 grant year, those cycles followed our traditional calendar year of January through December with the additional 6-month period. So the 22 EAF, 23 IOLTA, and 23 EAF all closed on January 30th, 2024. All right, next slide. And so just to give you a summary of the 2022 IOLTA and EAF funds, we administered roughly $93 million for the combined grants. Of that, there was about $433,000 that was left as unspent, which resulted in less than 1% of the grant being not spent. And so those unspent grant funds will be returned to the State Bar and distributed in future grant cycles. For IOLTA, there were 11 grantees with unspent funds out of the 102, and for EAF, there was 15 unspent or grantees with unspent funds out of the 102 grantees funded. And then for IOLTA, there were 5 providers who had budget deviations that exceeded 10%, which is the permissible amount, as well as 6 grantees in the EAF period that had budget deviations that exceeded the 10% allowance. Next slide. And so this is the 2023 grant year, where we distributed a combined $82 million. Of that, there was almost $1.4 million left as unspent. So this is a little higher than the prior grant year. The most of that was related to the EAF funds, where there's a little over 3% that was unspent, and less than 1% for the IOLTA. And again, those funds will be redistributed in future grant years. There were 14 grantees that had IOLTA expenditures unspent out of the 101 grantees, and for EAF, there were 15 grantees. And for the budget deviations that exceeded 10%, there were 4 of those in IOLTA and 6 in EAF. So next slide. So budget deviations are permissible up to 10%, and there are opportunities throughout the grant period to request a budget modification. The deadline for budget modifications for the 2022 IOLTA grant period were January 31st, 2023, and for EAF modifications, they were permitted up through February 2nd of 2024. And just as a reminder, the staff has the ability to approve budget modification requests between 10 and 25%, and then the commission must approve any budget modification that's greater than 25% or higher. And so I'm just going to walk you through sort of the grantees that did have budget deviations that exceeded the threshold and did not submit budget modifications to address those prior to the close of the grant period, or prior to the close of the deadline. So the first is Asian Americans Advancing Justice of Southern California. They had an EAF deviation of 10%, 10.01, so it's just slightly over. And so we did reach out for each of the grantees, and they did provide an explanation for theirs, and it was basically they rounded down from, but it is technically over the 10%. And then community lawyers had deviations in both their IOLTA and EAF grants, so they were around 18% each. Justice and Aging, their grant deviation or budget deviation was 27%, so that is higher than the 25% that would normally be approved by the commission. And so in the grantee explanations, they each have provided explanations in that last corner, and they tend to be around either staff transitions, moving money between different staff people, and sort of limited financial capacity to do it, as you heard the public comment earlier. Next slide. And so then again, La Raza Central Legal and Legal Aid Marin also had budget deviations that are in the 10 to 16% range. La Raza had both for IOLTA and EAF. Legal Aid of Marin only had IOLTA, and their explanations are also provided there on the left. So next slide. And so then Public Counsel and Riverside Legal Aid also had budget deviations ranging from 16% up to 20%. And again, they were mostly staff-related deviations, and there were some misunderstanding about whether or not budget deviations were required for those. And then the final slide for 2022 is San Luis Obispo, who had a 14% deviation. And so I believe they mischaracterized or they misreported some expenses on the wrong lines, and so I think that is what resulted in their other deviations. And so then moving to, unless you want to talk about individual grantees now, I'll move forward to the 2023 because it's a lot more of the same, and just run you through that quickly. AIDS Legal Referral Panel had an EAF deviation of 13%. They did not realize there was a revision was required. BetZedek also had a 14.8% for EAF. Next slide. California Indian Legal Services had a 10.95%, and La Raza Central Legal had, again, a EAF and IOLTA deviation of roughly 9% each. And the last one, Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles had an 11.22% deviation from their budget, and so there was some understaffing there, and again, they didn't realize that a budget modification was required. Okay, so Legal Aid Society of San Bernardino had a 22.2 or 06 deviation. And they thought that the previous modification they had submitted for EAF included an IOLTA, but it didn't. So next slide, Erica. So then we've got Public Counsel and WorkSafe, also in the 12 to 14 range, and their explanations again are also related to some personnel changes in the grant fund. And then the last one is Youth Law Center with EAF, which they had a 25.9% deviation, which again, that was above where the commission would have had to approve the budget modification. And they reported that it was, they reported a carryover, but they didn't submit a budget modification at the time, and they understood, they thought that they could submit it later, and so they missed that opportunity. I'll open it up to any questions if anybody wants to discuss this. The staff is recommending that the committee recommend that we approve all of these budget modifications to the commission. There was a resolution that was included in the memo that was posted online. It did include the wrong number for the IOLTA. Yes, IOLTA grants in 2022, that number, there was 11 grantees and not 12. So I've made a correction on this slide so that, and this would be the proposed resolution that we would ask you to consider. And I'm happy to discuss any questions, but I did want to just sort of say our reason for asking you to approve these at this point is there does seem to be a widespread misunderstanding from grantees about when budget modifications are required and how to calculate what the deviations are. So the staff has been addressing that with grantees. We did have a budget modification training program in September where we did communicate the sort of the standards for budget modification. We also provided them an Excel worksheet that would allow them to calculate their deviations ahead of time so they know whether or not a budget modification is necessary. And we've also changed our budget modification form so it makes it clearer what so it can calculate the deviation percentages so grantees can see that in real time. And so we're proposing through the end of 2024 grants that some latitude is provided to these grantees, and then we will starting next year where we've got more training and communication about the requirements for grant modifications or budget modifications rather, then we would start taking them in, a little more, they wouldn't just, require or recommend approval, excuse me. So I welcome any questions anyone might have about these.
So that was my question. So thank you for the clear explanation about what you've done to address, because it was somewhat striking on the chart, I think.
Yeah.
And was the training that you provided well attended, or?
It was very well attended because it was also a mixture of how to plan for overlapping IOLTA ones. So I do think that if memory serves me, there might have been like 121 participants, and then we sent it out via email, the recording for those who weren't able to watch it, and so every grantee has been provided with that link as well.
Terrific. Are there any other questions or comments?
I would move approval.
Thank you, Angie, for the motion. Is there a second?
I will second it. Gonzalez.
Thank you, Eloina. And is there any other comment or discussion? Okay, I think we are ready for the vote.
Gonzalez,
Yes.
King,
Yes.
Klein, Morales, Vargas,
Yes.
Blakemore.
Yes.
4 yeses, no nos, the motion carries.
I think that takes us to item 7.2.
All right. Thank you. All right. So now we will talk about the budget modifications that have been submitted thus far in 2024 that require approval or review. So go ahead, Erica, and advance the slide, please. So just as repeating the background, if you do budget, or grantees are able to submit budget modifications throughout the grant period. So we have received some budget modification requests for the 2024 EAF and IOLTA time period, and we've also received a couple requests from one grantee for 2022 and 2023 EAF budget modifications. They did come in after the stated deadline for submission of budget modifications, but they did come in prior to the end of those grant carryover periods, and so we're asking for consideration for those late submissions as well. So going to the first one, okay. So this table here shows the grantees who have submitted budget modifications that are between that 50 or that 10 and 50 or 25% approval level, and so the staff has reviewed and approved the ones that are listed here. And then next slide. And so this there are two that are over the 25% threshold that we'll ask the commission to review and approve. Elder Law and Advocacy has submitted a 2024 EAF budget modification for 34.2%. The resulting modification also, it deviates from the 75% personnel, 25% non-personnel recommended level, and the primary reason for the reason for that deviation of the 25-75 is they've moved funds from the lawyer salary down to contract services for clients because they hired a contract attorney to fill the role of that salary, the salary position that was not filled. So that did result in 25% being allocated to staff personnel versus with the difference being in that contract services line, which is technically, the commission has historically considered that as part of the staff calculation, even though it's not a personnel staff, because the understanding of the recruitment and retention crisis that's been happening in legal services. So when they need to outsource it to a contractor, that's typically been permissible. So staff is recommending approval of that grantee. And then the next one. So these are the two late submissions that came in from Inland Empire Latino Lawyers Association for their 2022 EAF grant and their 2023 EAF grant. While they would normally have been reviewed and approved by the staff because they are under the 25% threshold, because they came in after our budget submission deadline, but before the end of the grant, we're asking the commission to approve those instead because staff doesn't have the authority once those deadlines are passed. And so it's primarily, again, their changes are related to personnel, some staff or some space and technology and administrative costs. So they looked appropriate to the staff that reviewed them, but they do require commission approval. So moving forward.
And was there a reason that they were late? That was...
They had some turnover with their ED where the old ED left. They had a new ED who was sort of trying to kind of learn the ropes and get caught up in that transition. So I just think it kind of intersected at that same time. I had a lot of contact with them during that period. So they are a small organization that is really trying to transition leadership, and and it's taking them a little bit. So I would, I think they're trying, but there was a transition period that was a little
and
bumpy.
So it would be under perhaps they didn't understand what the requirement was, you think?
I think the prior ED left right at the end and the new ED came on. And so I don't think that this was probably on the radar right as she began her position. So I think it was kind of just an oversight and getting caught up in understanding the various grants that they had on their plate.
Sounds
so
great.
We've met with the executive director a lot and provided a lot of TA. So I think she's getting up to speed and is aware now of the responsibilities. Okay. So if the commission, we presented a resolution for you to consider, and also, of course, I'll be willing to ask or answer any questions you might have about these.
Does anyone have any questions? I don't see any. Is there a motion?
I will motion, Gonzalez.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Eloina and Angie. Is there any other discussion? If not, we're ready for a vote.
Gonzalez,
Yes.
King,
Yes.
Klein, Morales, Vargas,
Yes.
Blakemore.
Yes.
4 yeses, no nos, the motion carries.
I think that takes us to the next agenda item 7.3, which is the pro bono allocation test C narratives.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. So I'm going to go over 2 organizations that have pro bono allocation requests that are currently pending and sort of the circumstances surrounding that. So as you all may recall, under the IOLTA statute, organizations can seek additional funding. There's 10% of funding set aside in each county for pro bono allocation recipients. And in order to qualify for this additional funding, qualified legal services projects need to demonstrate that they recruit a substantial number of pro bono attorneys in the given county, and that the organization's principal means of service delivery in a given county is through this pro bono work. So formerly, there used to be a practice of having a threshold to establish the substantial numbers requirement by showing that the organization had recruited a minimum of 30 attorneys or 5% of the attorneys in a county, or 1,000 receiving 1,000 donated legal services hours from attorneys in the prior year when submitting the IOLTA EAF application. There has been a recent rule change that removed this threshold requirement. So now, in order for an organization to show that they recruit substantial numbers of pro bono attorneys, as well as that their principal means of service delivery through pro bono happens through the same test. So under this new rule, which was passed and made retroactive to July 18th. An organization can demonstrate this by showing that they receive more donated pro bono attorney hours than their staff attorney hours in a given county. Or if they are unable to demonstrate that, then they can provide a narrative that speaks to their service delivery model and their efforts to recruit and retain volunteer attorneys in support of their organization. So the 2 organizations that we're going to discuss today are Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, which had applied for the pro bono allocation in Imperial County. During the initial application review over the summer, this organization appeared to have met the threshold. In retrospect, that was not the case. But they do have more donated attorney hours than staff attorney hours in Imperial County. They just hadn't met that 30 attorney threshold that had previously been established. And so due to the rule change that went into effect retroactively in July, they meet the requirements now. But because they had not kind of gone through committee review as they should have at the time in July, it's being presented for your consideration today, but staff is recommending that they be found eligible in Imperial County for the allocation. And then Veterans Legal Institute is an organization that has received the pro bono allocation for a number of years in Los Angeles and Orange counties. But when they made an edit to their application over the summer, staff had not been alerted to the fact that they added Riverside and San Bernardino. And so it was, again, not brought to the committee's attention at the time, but a subsequent review of the application sort of revealed that. And so this organization did not meet that sort of numeric test that you would see under the rule. And so they are required to provide that narrative, like I mentioned, explaining sort of their service delivery. And, we provided that to you in the materials, but because their service model and their explanation are very similar to the bases on which they were approved in Los Angeles and Orange counties, staff is recommending that they also be found eligible for the allocation in Riverside and San Bernardino. We, for both of these organizations, determined these oversights before we ran the funding allocations. And so the way the funding formula was run was as if these organizations were eligible for the allocation. However, of course, if the committee were to go in a different direction, as noted in the memo, that, you know, the funding awards would be adjusted. But just so you all know, it has already sort of been included in their preliminary award amount that that had been shared with the organization. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, on the screen, we've shared the proposed resolution. No questions?
Someone willing to make oh, I think Angie is making a motion, but there, now
Move
she's
move
unmuted.
approval.
Thank you, Angie. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Javier. And okay, we are ready for roll call.
Gonzalez,
Yes.
King,
Yes.
Klein, Morales, Vargas,
Yes.
Blakemore.
Yes.
4 yeses, no nos, the motion carries.
Thank you for that. And that takes us to item 7.4. This is the item where we received a comment earlier in the public comment period about the disposition of request for reconsideration of 2025 IOLTA EAF funding denials. And I think, Erica, you're presenting that as well, right?
Yes, thanks. So during the IOLTA and EAF application period this year for 2025 funding, at the end of that period, 3 organizations were denied funding in the coming year, and 2 of them, the reason they were denied was for an incomplete application, and specifically those organizations had not provided either an audit or reviewed financial statement that was conducted by an independent certified public accountant. Under State Bar Rule 3.680E1, that is a firm requirement of the application, and staff needs these documents in order to confirm things like qualified expenditures when calculating award amounts. And so those organizations were granted extensions to provide their reviewed financial statements. One United Core Alliance was granted an extension through June 30th, and then UBISUtter Legal Center for Seniors was granted through July 15th. Neither organization, unfortunately, was able to meet their deadlines. And so in August, the commission found them ineligible for funding for lack of those documents. Under the State Bar rules, it refers to the schedule of charges and deadlines and says that under no circumstances is the commission able to grant an extension for the audit beyond the date upon which grant allocations are determined. In this case, this year, staff ran the funding allocations on August 14th. These organizations were notified that they were found ineligible, and under the State Bar rules, they are permitted to submit a request for reconsideration. However, given the wording of the schedule of charges and deadlines, it's staff and the Office of General Counsel's opinion that there is no flexibility to sort of go back and find them eligible now. In the case of United Core Alliance, we did eventually receive their reviewed financial statement in September, on September 13th. With UBISUtter, we received the request for reconsideration, but we still haven't received the financial review. And so, as I said, the recommendation and what we feel is the requirement under the rules is that the organization should, the denial of funding should be affirmed. And so that would be staff's recommendation to the committee, that you recommend the commission affirm their denial for funding in 2025.
So, Eric, if I might ask, it seems almost like this is jurisdictional, like we don't even have the ability to make this decision in because the deadline has passed and the rule is explicit about that?
Yeah, I think given the opportunity to submit the request for reconsideration, just in an abundance of, process, we wanted
Okay.
to allow that, but we, as I said, yeah, it does, we do feel that it's sort of a controlling requirement that the eligibility not be changed after the allocations have been determined.
Okay, are there questions or comments from committee members? Angie has her hand up.
So what happens? They don't get money from us. They try to limp along and reapply next year?
Correct. In terms of the state bar funding through IOLTA and EAF, they would not be receiving funding in 2025. In the case of United Core Alliance, they were a new applicant, so they have never received state bar funding. So this is not necessarily a loss of existing funding for them. In the case of Yuba Sutter, they were an existing grantee. I will note that 2024 IOLTA amounts increased significantly. I can't speak to this organization's specific situation, but a number of grantees have sort of, the commission allowed grantees to spread out those funds over up to 4 years. And so if the organization is able to, use their IOLTA funds over a longer period of time, there may be some aspect of that they can salvage. It didn't necessarily sound like that from what Mr. Carrico shared, but they are welcome to reapply for 2026 funding, and this denial for 2025 has no impact on their future eligibility. It really is on a year-by-year basis.
And as I recollect from our discussion, the audit that was not produced for this year would not be required for next year's application. Instead, they would need to submit an audit for the year closing in whatever that cycle is, right? That would be consistent with their 2025 grant application, right?
Yes, it's the fiscal year that concluded during the prior calendar year. So, if they have a July to June, it might be June 30th. If it's a calendar year, fiscal year, then it would be December 31st.
Angie, does that answer your questions? Do you have other comments?
Okay.
Anyone else on the commission have comments about this? Okay, is there a motion?
I guess we have no choice. So I guess I'll move approval.
Catherine,
Yes,
there's a hand raised for public comment.
okay, we're fine to have a public comment. So just as a reminder, we're limiting public comments to this agenda item and for 3 minutes. And welcome back, Mr. Carrico.
Hi, thank you for I can see your heart sort of in the support, but it's turning out the way I was a little bit afraid of, that we had a right to request reconsideration, but no power to grant that request. It might make sense to not have the reconsideration request opportunity if it is moot and has no value. And that's just sort of my thoughts at this moment.
Thank you for that comment, and we can ask staff to consider whether there should be a change in when reconsideration is allowed if in these kind of circumstances. So
or if maybe grant some ability to change something. It used to be the case that you could change something, but now with algorithms and everything being allocated all at one time, my understanding is in the budget process, there's no ability to backpedal or bring in an exceptional situation. It's just, there's a line and that's it. So that maybe but it used to be my understanding, if my understanding is correct, that one could make an exception later on for extenuating circumstances outside the control of the agency itself, like as was the case with us. But thank you very much. I understand you doing what you can, and I wish you a good rest of the meeting.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for hanging in here and offering another comment. We appreciate that.
Okay.
Okay, are there any other public comments on this item or any other questions from committee members? Go ahead, Angie.
Well, that does raise the question, the who makes that rule about no further allowing a reconsideration that's futile? I mean, can that rule be changed so it's clear that there is no reconsideration past the allocation date?
I think that is something that the Rules Committee could consider through the codification process if there's desire to revisit that rule. And
Should
its
this
efficacy.
committee make that suggestion? How does that get transmitted?
I can, based on the discussion today, I can take that to the Rules Committee.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angie, for that comment. Any other questions or comments? Okay. I think you made a motion, Angie, before we started the discussion. I don't recall a second to that, if my memory is correct.
I did move.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I will second.
Thank you, Elowina. I think we are ready to vote.
Gonzalez,
Yes.
King,
Yes.
Klein, Morales, Vargas,
Yes.
Blakemore.
Yes.
4 yeses, no nos, the motion carries.
Okay, and I think this takes us actually to our last agenda item. We're moving along at item 7.5, which is the budget-related issues and recommended approval of the IOLTA EAF budget proposals for 2025.
Great, so I'm going to present on the 2025 IOLTA EAF budgets and just give you some background on the budget review process and office practice, review any late or incomplete submissions that we received, talk a little bit about the budgeting practice of recommended expense ratios, capital additions, requests, and then ultimately get to the committee's recommendations about budget approval to the commission.
Thanks for that, Erica.
Yeah, so budget submissions under the rules are once staff releases the tentative allocations, which we did in August, they were due 30 days later. So September 25th, we received budgets and staff has been reviewing and working with grantees since then to make any updates or clarify any questions or concerns about the budget submission. A couple of things that we came across initially were late submissions and incomplete submissions. So formerly, the committee would have to approve any late or incomplete submissions. There was a rule change last year allowing staff to accept a late submission up to 1 business day after the deadline. And so in this case, this year, we did have 7 organizations submit their budgets late, but all of them were within the 1-day sort of grace period. And after, speaking with the organizations and reviewing their explanation for the lateness, staff accepted all of those. So we're reporting this out to you just, for your knowledge or edification, but to let you know that staff did accept these late submissions. And then we had a few organizations that when staff opened the budgets, felt that they were incomplete to an extent that it would have been difficult to really perform a comprehensive review without getting more information from the grantee first. And so based on our follow-up with those organizations, we received prompt responses from them and quick work to make the necessary edits so staff could perform a review. And so we've accepted those as well. But in the case of the incomplete submissions, we will be following up with those organizations to communicate with their executive director if we have not already about the incompleteness and the the importance of submitting complete and timely budget proposals or any other grant materials in order to move the process along. So just to let you know that we are following up with organizations and making sure that they understand, and if they need any technical assistance, that staff can provide that as well. So another major portion of budget review and approval, it has to do with expense ratios that are recommended. So the office practice for probably almost a decade has been that 75% or more of an organization's budget should be devoted to personnel, and then 25% or less to non-personnel. And then 75% or more to program expenses, and 25% or less to administrative expenses. And the idea being that the emphasis is on the program and service delivery to indigent persons or support services in the case of support centers. When an organization submits a budget proposal that deviates from these percentages, we elevate it to the committee for review and approval. We had a few organizations that deviated in this instance, and most of them were in the personnel, non-personnel category this year. So Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach had 53% devoted to personnel. In their case, they made a capital additions request, which we're going to talk about next, and that's really primarily what skewed their percentage. They had a large amount of money and a request for making mortgage payments and infrastructure improvements. In the case of Justice and Diversity Center, they came in just below 75%. They were around 74% for personnel, and that had to do with the way certain personnel were categorized. So they work with their affiliate or sister organization and share some staff. And so those staff are actually considered, I believe, under the contract services category. And so it just put them off a little bit. And then with Riverside Legal Aid, they also came in at 68% personnel, and that was also because of contract situation, contracting services to the program for client services. And then I apologize for the typo with the Southern California Immigrant Project. It's 70.93, not 7,000. And they also have a contract service situation where they hire interpreters, and they devoted some of the funding to their space costs, and so that brought them a little bit low. But in the case of JDC, Riverside Legal Aid, and Southern California Immigrant Project, all three of those organizations were recommending for approval because it really was the way that sort of their contracting for services to clients is just represented in the budget, but we still feel that it is for service delivery. With Apilo, we are not recommending approval of that deviation because of the capital additions request. And then on the program to administration ratio, Family Violence Appellate Project had a deviation for both their IOLTA and EAF proposals. Very slight deviations where they explained that their executive director would be doing work that was overall supportive of their program, but would fall under the administrative line item. And so we're recommending approval of those as well. And then another expense ratio that we follow through these budgets is their benefits percentage. That benefits shouldn't be more than 40% compared to salaries. We didn't have any applications this year, budget proposals this year that deviated in that way. So there are none to review today. And then the capital additions request. So in order for an organization to make a real property capital additions request in their budget proposal, they typically would need to be providing documentation for what the expense is, and then also providing a written justification of how it's going to enhance or improve their operations and their service delivery to clients. So with Apilo, they requested $600,000 in their IOLTA budget to go towards their balloon payment for their mortgage, as well as infrastructure improvements. Under the guidelines that we have for purchase of real property, as I mentioned, we would need some documentation regarding those expenditures. And we requested it, staff requested it a couple times. We have not received any documentation for that. And we also don't really have much more narrative about the need for the funds beyond sort of what you see on the screen about the mortgage balloon payment and the infrastructure improvements. And so without more information and documentation, staff does not feel that it can recommend approval of this. So so we are recommending that instead of approving the capital additions request, the committee would direct Apilo to revise its budget and move the $600,000 into activities that are more clearly qualifying and can be approved. So the motion on the proposed resolution just sort of summarizes the expense ratio deviations that I just talked about, as well as the capital additions requests from Apilo that we're recommending to be denied. And then that last paragraph is essentially just summarizing that after resolving any of these issues regarding expense ratios and capital additions, that the committee would recommend approval of the budgets to the full commission at their meeting next week.
So on Apilo, you've asked for information, you haven't received it, and now you're asking them to do a budget modification. Is there a deadline by which that budget modification would need to be to you? Because I guess I'm trying to understand, like, you've run the allocation. This is an amount they have. They're not spending it consistent in a way that has met your ability to review it, right? And so they have to do a budget modification. But if they don't do the budget modification, where does that, and what's the deadline for that? When do we, I guess I'm just trying to understand procedurally how this works.
Right. Yes. So, depending on the committee's action today, staff would follow up with the organization today, for example, to let them know that, it's not being recommended for approval and that it would be best for them to revise the budget before the commission meeting next week so that it can be recommended for approval based on whatever the changes they've made. I would think that staff would need at least a day or two to review and confirm that the changes have been made. So I would say, by Wednesday of next week, in case there are any other outstanding questions, that we could have some time to follow up with the organization. But to your point that if the changes are not made or they're not satisfactory for any reason, I think the recommendation that staff would make is that their budget be approved up to the amount that, less the capital additions. So whatever their original allocation amount, less the capital additions, until they make the necessary changes. So not changing the organization's award, but not approving a budget that includes items that, are not recommended for those expenditures. So, so they would eventually sort of receive approval for the full award amount once they are able to submit a budget that can be approved.
But then would we have to approve that budget at the point that it was submitted? It looks to me like roughly half of the budget, right? So
yes, that it is about
49 point something percent.
It's not necessarily half their budget, that amount. It just skewed kind of the amount that's devoted to like personnel versus non-personnel. So they would still have a significant amount that, for example, starting the year that they could use the funds for. But I would need to check on if there could be wording, for example, if we reached that point at the commission meeting to allow staff to approve it once, if everything is in line with what we would consider an approved budget or approvable budget, if that could be permitted so that we don't have to bring it back to a meeting, or if it would need to come to, say, the commission's first meeting of the year. I would need to check on that.
Okay, Angie, did you have a question?
If so, they've already been informed that this allocation is not kosher, and they have had the opportunity to fix it, and they haven't yet. And so if they don't by next week or whenever the deadline that you impose, then they get their allocation minus 600,000.
Right, that would be the recommendation, that the budget that can, the parts of the budget that can be approved, and then until such time that they make the changes, for the 600,000, then that would be approved at a later time.
So worst case scenario, the 600,000 would go back into the fund and could be used at revision times for other agencies.
I think it would be reallocated next year if they didn't spend it, or do they have longer than? I guess there's like, what is the ultimate? Because these grant funds could be spent over 4 years, as I read.
Right.
So do they have up to 4 years then to make, under the proposal of staff, to come up with a plan to spend the money? Is that what would happen?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think the advice that we would give the organization is to reallocate it to clearly qualifying work. And then if, for example, they wanted to make a capital additions request later and they had the appropriate documentation and justification, that they could seek a budget revision at that point. But really the emphasis would be on just revising the budget now to be something that is approvable by the commission.
So the 600,000 allocation would sort of sit in abeyance. It would be there available to them if and when they can do the documentation.
It would be available to them until they submit a budget proposal that would be recommended for approval. So whether that's moving it into just, say, personnel, like staff salaries to provide qualifying legal services, or
I'm sorry to interrupt, but they could take the 600,000 and decide it's not going to be used for the property.
Correct. Yeah, and that's actually the recommendation at this point, is that they move it into something else, not keep it in the capital additions.
If they really want to use it and they are unable to provide the right kind of documentation to allow it, then it just sort of sits there for the rest of the 4-year grant period.
I think it's different a little bit. It's the recommendation seems to be that they submit a budget that shows how they are going to spend it. That if that would be qualifying, so the commission could approve it. I think it is, in fairness, unclear what happens if they don't submit a budget revision. And I don't think we know the answer to that. So maybe that's what staff could figure out for us. If, like, I mean, not us, but figure out as part of the presentation at the meeting next week about what happens if they don't submit a budget revision, right?
I think Dwan has something to add on that point. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I say, you know, I don't think it will get to that. I think it will be enough to say, but I get your point. Like, if they're insistent on like budgeting for something that's not qualifying, I get your point. I don't think they should have 4 years. I think, and we can check with Brady and Raul after the meeting, bring something to the commission, but maybe the drop dead deadline is February, the next commission meeting to be, and I think that's pretty generous already, given that we've already in advance have given them this technical assistance that this is not going to be qualifying. If we're going to go back again and still going to release their funding, I think that's very generous. So I don't think we're going to need to get there, but again, if you want that clarity, I think that might help with setting a firm deadline. Yeah,
understand, because when I realized the overlay of the 4 years, and honestly, what Erica said makes sense to me. Make a budget modification now. If at some point during that 4 years, you can appropriately provide documentation for the capital expenditure and what the bar requires, then you can make a subsequent budget modification request and kind of end up in the place that you've proposed now, but you're at the moment out of time you haven't provided documentation, so you're out of time. So please submit a budget revision, and fine, because we're not meeting till February, so
Exactly.
generous amount of time. But Heidi, sorry, like you had
Yeah,
a comment.
the last thing, I mean, I do think we need probably a consult with OGC, but I think that the way the rule reads that their eligibility is conditioned on an approved budget from the commission. So I don't think there's any possibility of a, you know, sort of a partial approval and leaving the $600,000 potentially in a questionable pot, because their allocation is formula based and there is a requirement that they submit a budget that gets approved. So I do feel like there's an eligibility issue at play here. That's my reading, but I do think we should have OGC weigh in on it and give us their.
So I think we have to leave it to all of you to consult, but if they're found not eligible next week because they didn't submit a budget, I mean, then that's sort of a different scenario that the commission would find them ineligible because they didn't meet a grant term and condition of submitting a budget. And then I guess that has a different outcome. So I can't say which one is right, but I think just providing clarity in that kind of more granular way about what the commission can or can't do with this circumstance would be helpful. So go
Absolutely.
ahead.
Well, should we put in the resolution that we recommend the organization revise its budget by whatever date?
I think it's by next Wednesday so that it can be considered at the few. So that would be the 6th. So that makes sense to me. Good suggestion. I mean, my recollection is that please correct me if I'm wrong, because sometimes I get confused, but my recollection is that this organization has had some challenges getting information submitted on time, which I think we've tried to address in other ways, and it looks like there's still a continuing problem. So I don't know where that factors in, but I think it's helpful to have in this moment a clear deadline as to when they have to submit the documentation so that it could be approved.
And Erica, you might want to copy their board president on it, because
Yes,
we've had challenges. So, okay.
Yeah.
And just for a little context, we did have a meeting with them within, I would say, the last month, where we did address their lack of responsiveness and their frequent lateness. And so we met with, you know, Erica Connolly and Michael Chong and myself met with the ED as well as their board members. So it just very recently, we did have a meeting on these very issues. And this is not the only thing that is late from this organization post that meeting. So there is some context there.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks for the addition to the, and thanks for so quickly making it, Erica, or whoever did that. So, is there any other questions from committee members? Is there any public comment that I have overlooked? Okay. So with that, I don't think we yet have a motion. So is there a motion?
I will
I'll
move.
motion.
I will second.
So I heard you. So who was making the motion and you were seconding now? Was that Javier?
Sure, I'll motion.
Okay, you're motioning. Eloina's seconding. Sorry, Angie, if you were saying something, I overlooked you, but now we have a motion. So could staff do the roll call, please?
Gonzalez,
Yes.
King,
Yes.
Klein, Morales, Vargas,
Yes.
Blakemore.
Yes.
4 yeses, no nos, the motion carries.
Okay, and then there's a second part where we need to approve the grant awards that were included in the memo. Is that right? Or
That was all part of it.
That was the last paragraph.
last part? Thank you. Okay,
Um,
great. Yep, attachment A. I see it now. I was just so focused on the change in date. I forgot that part. Great.
No
So
problem.
is there any other business for us to attend to?
No, that's it. That's it.
What an amazing committee to finish, I think, like in an hour and 15 minutes with some meaty topics. And I appreciate all of you and the care that you take in adjusting things and listening. So thank you very much. And I think with that, do we need a motion to adjourn, or we can just adjourn? We're just adjourning, and we will see each other next Friday, I hope. And some of us will see each other on November 6th, I believe, for the Rules Committee, if you happen to be on that as well. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to
Thank you,
staff.
everyone.
Yeah.